The cold, grey dawn stretched over the Rhine, shrouding the river in a mist that clung to every steel beam of the Ludendorff Bridge. The structure groaned under the weight of its own age, battered by months of war, yet stubbornly still standing. German soldiers lined the banks, their faces pale, eyes scanning the fog for any sign of movement. Every creak of metal, every ripple across the water, set hearts racing. From the eastern bank, the distant hum of engines grew louder. American forces were advancing faster than anyone had predicted, their tanks and jeeps cutting through the fog like knives. German officers exchanged hurried glances, realizing with a sinking dread that the bridge, their last hope to control the Rhine, was still intact. Orders from Berlin had been clear: destroy it. Yet somehow it remained. On the bridge itself, a handful of engineers worked frantically, sweating under the weight of impending doom. Explosives were primed, wires snaking across the structure, but every second that ticked by increased the danger. One wrong move, one sudden attack, could send the bridge collapsing into the river, along with everyone on it. Then, in the distance, figures emerged. American soldiers, bold and relentless, began their crossing. Their movements precise, fearless. German officers could hardly believe their eyes. Every step the Americans took was a direct threat, a strategic disaster that no one had fully anticipated. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the ranks. One officer muttered under his breath, almost as if saying it aloud might make it true, "The war, it's over." The tension hung heavy over the bridge. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The river, the fog, the groaning metal, all converging into a single terrifying truth. The Americans were crossing, unstoppable, and the fragile line holding the heart of Germany's defense was beginning to crumble. And in that frozen dawn, with smoke and fog curling over the Rhine, a chilling realization settled over both sides. Nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after the first American footsteps touched the eastern bank of the Rhine, German command rooms buzzed with tension. Maps were spread across tables, fingers tracing lines that led to nowhere. Intelligence reports had underestimated the speed and boldness of the American advance. Scouts who were supposed to observe the enemy had reported delays, only for the Americans to appear out of the mist. Tanks and infantry pressing forward like a relentless tide. High-ranking officers paced back and forth, their boots echoing against cold concrete floors. Oberstleutnant von Braun's face was pale, eyes darting between the telegrams and the maps. He had been certain. The bridge at Remagen would never survive long enough for enemy forces to cross. Hitler's orders had been explicit: demolish every crossing over the Rhine. Yet here it stood, an unintended invitation for the Allies to pour into the heart of Germany. The tension in the room was suffocating. Major Weber slammed a fist on the table. How did they get here so fast? Every report said they were still 10 kilometers away. He turned to his fellow officers. The bridge, someone failed us. Someone didn't follow orders. It wasn't just frustration, it was disbelief. How could such a small force, with nothing but courage and cunning, exploit their miscalculations so easily? German intelligence had relied on predictions, on assumptions that had already proven flawed in countless ways. And now the consequences were immediate and terrifying. Meanwhile, reports came in of American ingenuity on the battlefield. Soldiers improvising crossings, engineers reinforcing unstable approaches, tank units maneuvering through terrain that had been assumed impassable. The German officers could only watch as their carefully constructed defenses crumbled before their eyes. The overconfidence that had carried them through earlier campaigns now mocked them with every American step onto the bridge. As tension mounted, Von Braun whispered to himself, a bitter mix of awe and fear. We misjudged them, and now we pay the price. Every miscalculation, every delay, every assumption that the enemy would act predictably had led to this moment. The Americans had seized the initiative, and the bridge, once a symbol of German control, had become a fatal vulnerability. In the command room, the officers exchanged grim glances. They had underestimated not just the enemy's speed, but their daring, their determination, their willingness to risk everything for a chance at victory. And as the sound of distant gunfire and engines drifted across the Rhine, it became painfully clear the stage was set for disaster, and the consequences would ripple far beyond Remagen. The decision came swiftly, almost recklessly, yet with a clarity that only desperation and opportunity can produce. American commanders surveyed the Ludendorff Bridge through binoculars, weighing the risks. Demolitions should have turned it into a shattered ruin, yet somehow it still spanned the Rhine, its steel skeleton groaning under the stress of war. Waiting for reinforcements would cost precious time the enemy could use to regroup, fortify, and destroy the bridge beyond repair. The gamble was audacious. Cross now, before the opportunity vanished. Soldiers gripped their rifles, hearts pounding, as engineers worked feverishly to patch the unstable sections of the bridge. Every plank, every steel beam had to hold under the combined weight of tanks, trucks, and foot soldiers. One misstep could send dozens plunging into the icy river below. Yet the men pressed forward, their determination undimmed by the danger beneath their feet. As the first waves advanced, German machine guns erupted from concealed positions. The staccato bursts echoing against the metal and water. Smoke and dust rose from the far end of the bridge, where explosions threatened to split the structure. American soldiers ducked, rolled, and returned fire with precision, improvising cover wherever they could. Engineers shouted instructions over the roar of combat, reinforcing weak points with whatever they could find. Timbers, sandbags, even abandoned vehicles. Each act of courage was magnified by the stakes. One failure here meant total disaster. Corporal James Hartmann led a small squad across the midpoint of the bridge, moving as if the river itself might swallow them at any moment. His eyes met those of a German soldier entrenched along the edge, a brief, frozen moment of recognition between enemies. Hartmann pressed on, knowing hesitation could be fatal. Around him, men pulled wounded comrades from harm's way, carried explosives to secure points, and shouted encouragement that carried over the chaos. The bridge trembled, metal bending under the combined pressure of men and machinery. Yet against all odds, the Americans advanced, foot by foot, defying gravity, fate, and expectation. Every successful crossing pushed them closer to the eastern bank, closer to a foothold that could change the course of the war. At the far end, officers watched, disbelief etched on their faces. What had been intended as a temporary delay for the Americans had transformed into a full-scale, unstoppable advance. The audacity of the gamble, the sheer determination of ordinary soldiers, was reshaping history before their eyes. The Ludendorff Bridge, once thought to be a tactical lifeline for Germany, had become the stage for a turning point neither side would forget, and as the first tanks rumbled onto solid ground beyond the Rhine, the realization settled over both sides. This gamble could very well decide the fate of the war. Every man who had risked everything to cross was now part of a moment that would echo far beyond the river, far beyond Remagen itself. The first shock had passed, but the ripple effects were only beginning. German officers congregated in hastily commandeered command posts, faces pale, voices taut with fear and frustration. The Americans had crossed, and with each passing minute, the reality became more undeniable. The bridge was no longer just a gap over water. It was a gateway into the heart of Germany. Major Weber slammed a fist against the table, scattering maps and intelligence reports. How could they get this far? Orders were clear. The bridge, destroy it. Every crossing over the Rhine must be obliterated. His voice cracked, betraying a panic that had begun to infect the room. Others tried to calm him, offering excuses about failed demolitions and miscommunications, but the words fell flat. The truth was unbearable. Their meticulous plans, their years of preparation were unraveling before their eyes. Outside, the sounds of battle drifted through the morning mist. Artillery fire shook the ground, and distant explosions rattled windows. Desperate German counterattacks launched along the banks, but they were chaotic, uncoordinated, and swiftly repelled. Tanks became easy targets in narrow passages. Infantry units stumbled into ambushes. Communications were fragmenting. Radio operators scrambled to relay orders, but static confusion and the sheer pace of the American advance rendered most commands useless. In the command room, Oberstleutnant von Braun watched in disbelief as reports streamed in. Entire units were retreating or surrendering. Every failed counterattack was another nail in the coffin of German confidence. Soldiers' faces reflected fear, exhaustion, and an almost unspoken resignation. The air was thick with the scent of defeat. "I never thought it would come to this," von Braun muttered, his hand resting on a map that now seemed more like a funeral notice than a strategy guide. Around him, fellow officers avoided eye contact, unwilling to speak the words that hovered in the room. The war might truly be lost. Each attempt to regain control only confirmed their vulnerability. The Americans had seized the initiative, and nothing in their experience could undo what had already been set in motion. Desperation drove them to rash decisions. Orders were given, withdrawn and rewritten, only to be ignored in the chaos. Soldiers in the field acted on instinct rather than strategy, fighting not for victory but for survival. Bridges, towns, and defensive positions fell in quick succession. Each loss compounded the sense of helplessness, a creeping realization that the war was slipping beyond their grasp. By mid-afternoon, the psychological collapse was complete. Officers who had once exuded confidence were now shadows of themselves, their authority eroded by failure. Panic had seeped into every level of command. The Americans were not just advancing, they were reshaping the battlefield entirely, turning German strengths into liabilities as the sun began to set over the Rhine. A chilling truth settled over those who remained. This was not a temporary setback. The crossing at Remagen had shattered the illusion of control. The Germans could fight, retreat, and regroup, but the initiative, the momentum, was gone, and with it, any hope that the tide of the war could be reversed. The collapse was not just tactical, it was psychological. In that moment, despair became palpable. For the first time, German officers confronted a reality they had long refused to accept. Their defenses were crumbling, their soldiers demoralized, and the Americans had broken through what had been considered an impenetrable line. The war, once seemingly within their grasp to prolong or even dictate, now teetered on the edge of inevitable defeat. Amid the chaos on the eastern bank of the Rhine, the human cost of the battle became painfully clear. Smoke curled over the river, mingling with the morning mist, as explosions rocked the bridge and the surrounding fields. Soldiers from both sides moved with urgent purpose, each step measured against fear and survival. The Americans, having secured a foothold, pushed forward with a mix of precision and desperation. Every crossing, every maneuver was a gamble, and every soldier knew the stakes were nothing less than life or death. Engineers raced along the trembling steel of the Ludendorff Bridge, reinforcing weakened beams, shoring up sections that threatened to collapse under the weight of tanks and foot soldiers. Sparks flew as tools struck metal, sweat and grime painting their faces, but no one slowed. A misplaced plank could send dozens plunging into the icy river below, and yet they pressed on, driven by duty and the knowledge that the war's outcome now rested on their actions. Corporal James Hartmann led his squad through a hail of gunfire, their rifles responding in rhythmic bursts. Each soldier moved with a combination of instinct and courage, dragging the wounded to safer positions, returning fire with precision and improvising cover wherever possible. One soldier, barely able to stand after a grazing wound, refused evacuation, insisting on helping his comrades reinforce a critical section of the bridge. It was an act of bravery that mirrored thousands of others, small moments of heroism threading together to hold back disaster. Across the river, German soldiers fought with equal ferocity, their morale faltering but their resolve unbroken. They unleashed machine guns, attempted desperate counterattacks, and tried to destabilize the bridge with explosives. Yet the Americans adapted with a combination of ingenuity and determination. Every obstacle thrown in their path was met with quick thinking, improvisation, and an unyielding will to succeed. The bridge trembled with the combined weight of men, machinery, and chaos, but against all odds it held. Tanks rumbled forward, crossing to the eastern bank and giving the Americans the foothold they needed to establish a defensive perimeter. Engineers cheered silently, exhausted but triumphant, as the structural integrity of the bridge endured under impossible conditions. Amid the noise and smoke, small acts of humanity punctuated the horror. Soldiers helped each other across broken sections, offered words of encouragement, and carried those too wounded to move on their own. In the midst of one of history's pivotal battles, courage and sacrifice became more than strategy. They became the heartbeat of survival. By late afternoon, the Americans had consolidated their position. The bridge, once teetering on the edge of destruction, now served as a lifeline for troops, vehicles, and supplies. It was a testament not only to engineering skill, but to human endurance and bravery under fire. Each man who had risked everything to cross the Ludendorff Bridge had played a role in reshaping the battlefield, and perhaps the war itself. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the Rhine, it became clear this was more than a tactical victory. It was a moment that would echo through history, a reminder that courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice could alter the course of events, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The aftermath of the crossing settled over the German command like a heavy, suffocating fog. Officers gathered in a dimly lit room, maps sprawled across tables, reports scattered like the remnants of a dream long shattered. The hum of distant gunfire and the roar of engines from the eastern bank served as a grim reminder. The Americans had not only crossed, they had seized a foothold that could not easily be undone. Oberstleutnant von Braun stared at the maps, tracing the paths the Americans had carved through their defenses. His hands trembled slightly as he realized the stark truth. Every failed demolition, every misjudgment, every delay had led to this moment. Major Weber, pacing near a window, shook his head in disbelief. They've done it, right under our noses, he muttered, voice barely audible over the tension in the room. The officers exchanged glances, the weight of reality pressing down with an almost physical force. Years of planning, years of discipline and strategy had crumbled in a single daring maneuver. The Ludendorff Bridge, once a symbol of German control, now represented vulnerability and collapse. For the first time, many of them admitted, silently, privately, that the war might truly be lost. "It's over," von Braun whispered, almost to himself, the words tasting bitter but undeniably true. Around him, others nodded, some silent, some muttering in hushed agreement. The phrase, once unthinkable, carried the weight of fact, the inevitability of consequence. The Allies now had a direct path into the heart of Germany. Every hour the bridge remained intact, allowed the Americans to strengthen their position, press further, and dictate the pace of the war. Tension shifted into resignation. Officers who had shouted orders in defiance now sat in stunned silence, contemplating the futility of their previous commands. Their pride, their certainty, and their sense of invincibility had been stripped away in the span of a single morning. For the men on the eastern bank, the crossing was another battle, another victory. But for the Germans, it was the beginning of a reckoning. And yet, even in defeat, there was a haunting clarity. The human cost of misjudgment, of overconfidence, of underestimating an opponent's courage and ingenuity had never been clearer. The crossing at Remagen was more than a tactical disaster. It was a historical turning point, one that would be remembered not just for strategy, but for the moment when hope faltered and the truth of inevitability became undeniable. As the room fell into quiet reflection, the distant sounds of the river, the bridge, and the advancing Americans served as a stark reminder. The war for Germany was on the brink of ending. The acknowledgement hung in the air, heavy, somber, and final. The Ludendorff Bridge would not stand for long. Days later, its steel framework finally gave way, collapsing into the Rhine with a thunderous roar. Yet by then, the Americans had already established a stronghold on the eastern bank, and the bridge's brief survival had achieved something far greater than anyone could have predicted. It had opened the gateway to Germany, accelerating the end of the war. Across the Allied forces, the daring feat became legend. Soldiers spoke of the audacity, the courage, and the ingenuity that had turned a fragile bridge into a lifeline. Each man who crossed, each engineer who risked life and limb to hold the structure together, had contributed to a moment that would echo through history. The crossing at Remagen inspired hope and determination, proving that calculated risk and human courage could reshape the course of events. On the German side, the collapse of the bridge served as a somber lesson in overconfidence and misjudgment. Officers and soldiers alike came to understand how fragile even the strongest strategies could be when confronted by an opponent willing to act decisively, fearlessly, and creatively. The crossing was a symbol not just of tactical brilliance, but of the high cost of underestimating human determination. Today, the story of Remagen is remembered not only for its military significance, but for its human drama. It is a tale of desperation and heroism, of fear and resilience, and of how ordinary men, faced with extraordinary circumstances, made decisions that shaped the fate of nations. The bridge may have fallen, but the courage it inspired continues to stand tall in memory. The legacy of Remagen reminds us that history is often defined by moments of audacity, moments when individuals take chances that defy expectation, and moments when the tide of events can shift in an instant. It honors the sacrifices of all who fought on both sides, and leaves a lasting impression of the cost, the courage, and the human spirit that endured against impossible odds. And as the Rhine flows silently beneath the ruins of the Ludendorff Bridge, it carries with it the echoes of a crossing that changed the war and the world forever.